This is one of the most important days, in my opinion, in American history. It's our declaration of economic independence.
This is not the act of a friend. Today's decision will add to uncertainty in the global economy.
It's 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time and 6 a.m. in the West, continuing the ABC's coverage of Donald Trump's so-called Liberation Day. The US president has outlined a raft of tariffs, which many fear are the start of a global trade war. He's announced a minimum baseline tariff of 10%. Australian exports will be impacted by that figure. He's also singled out Australia for banning American beef imports. The Prime Minister rules out reciprocal tariffs on the US, with the development expected to dominate day 6 of the federal election campaign. Anthony Albanese has started the day in Melbourne, while opposition leader Peter Dutton is in Perth. Also making news this hour, Myanmar's military government declares a temporary ceasefire as the death toll from last week's devastating earthquake climbs past 3,000. We'll have the latest from our reporter on the ground shortly. Israel announces plans to seize large areas of land in Gaza to try and pressure Hamas to release more hostages. The latest threat comes as local health authorities say 53 Palestinians have been killed in a fresh wave of Israeli strikes. And we're live to outback Queensland, where primary producers in flood-affected areas are facing the prospect of selling farms that have been in families for generations. It's Thursday, the 3rd of April. I'm Dan Borsche, coming to you from the lands of the Darug people here in Parramatta in Western Sydney. This is ABC News Mornings. Donald Trump's been promising major trade action since he took office 10 weeks ago, and now he's announced sweeping reciprocal tariffs in an attempt to revive US industry and return America to what he calls its golden age. But in doing so, many experts say it risks sparking a global trade war as countries retaliate with countermeasures.
This is Liberation Day, waiting for a long time.
The US president made his announcement in the White House Rose Garden at an event billed at Make America Wealthy Again. Different rates will apply to different countries, and Washington's allies haven't been spared. In his executive order, there'll be a minimum baseline tariff of 10%, with that rate applying to Australian exports to the market. Mr. Trump calls it one of the most important days in American history.
It's our declaration of economic independence. For years, hardworking American citizens were forced to sit on the sidelines as other nations got rich and powerful, much of it at our expense. But now it's our turn to prosper, and in so doing, use trillions and trillions of dollars to reduce our taxes and pay down our national debt, and it'll all happen very quickly.
The president singled out Australia during his Rose Garden event. Last year, Australia sent about 400,000 tonnes of beef to the US, worth about $4 billion, making it the local sector's top export market. But Australia has been closed off to US fresh beef since 2003, when exports were banned over fears of mad cow disease. The US argues the biosecurity requirements are now negligible.
They ban American beef, yet we imported $3 billion of Australian beef from them just last year alone. They won't take any of our beef. They don't want it because they don't want it to affect their farmers. And you know what? I don't blame them, but we're doing the same thing right now, starting about midnight tonight, I would say.
The US also disagrees with the premise of the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, claiming it allows for damaging pricing policies that undervalue American innovation and cause billions of dollars in lost sales. Under the PBS, the government negotiates prices directly with suppliers to make them cheaper. US officials say that means cheaper generic versions are preferenced over higher-priced originals, denying the makers their intellectual property rights. About 930 prescription medicines are on the scheme. US trade grievances also make mention of Australia's local content streaming requirements and new social media laws. Ultimately, the measures will have some impact in Australia. But overall, exports to the United States represent less than 5% of total goods from here, compared to our biggest trading partner, China, that accounts for a quarter of all export dollars. Japan, South Korea, India also come in before the US, according to the United Nations Comtrade database. Australia also runs at a trade deficit with the US, meaning it exports more goods and services than imports from the country. Today's announcement of reciprocal tariffs follows the US President's introduction of duties on steel and aluminium, along with a blanket 25% tariff on foreign-made vehicles and auto parts. China, Mexico and Canada and the European Union are also being targeted.
Europe did not start this confrontation. We think it is wrong. But my message to you today is that we have everything we need to protect our people and our prosperity. We have the largest single market in the world. We have the strength to negotiate. We have the power to push back.
Tariffs essentially are a tax on goods, and American consumers fear their costs will rise. Household and business confidence in the US is low, and there are fears the new measures will send inflation skyrocketing. Since mid-February, close to $8 trillion have been wiped off the value of US stocks due to the uncertainty surrounding the Trump administration's trade measures. Small business owners fear the impact.
Nothing is safe from these tariffs. The policy essentially is a total loss for small businesses. It's based on the idea that we can just start manufacturing everything here overnight, and that's not how a free trade market existed in the first place. So to think of the idea of being able to switch to that overnight is not a very plausible thing.
Well, let's go live to North America, where our correspondent Carrington Clark joins us from Washington. Carrington, how impactful will these tariffs be on the global economy?
Well, the US president was promising a big announcement, and what he's announced today promises to upend the trade orthodoxy that the world has lived in for decades. The United States, the single biggest economy in the world for a country, is effectively putting up barriers, isolating itself really from other international countries, other countries who it does international trade with. This has major ramifications for global growth. The most immediate impact will be that Americans will pay more for imported goods. 10% on all imports into the United States. And this is a scary prospect for Americans who have only just come out on the other side of what was at one point four-decade high inflation here in the United States. And this potentially will mean that the Federal Reserve here in the United States may have to look at interest rate settings if we see inflation start to build. Now, Donald Trump says that this has multi-effects on the US economy. He's looking for more revenue, tax revenue, to be collected when imports come into the United States. He says that's going to raise trillions of dollars. He also says it will force companies to produce more in the United States, and then he says that will eventually lead to lower prices. Now, many economists disagree with that prognosis, instead saying that this will only force up prices higher. It puts pressure on other countries. What is the appropriate response? Do you try to take on Donald Trump directly? Do you put up trade barriers of your own in order to force him back to the negotiating table? Or do you do what some other countries seem to be suggesting and just say, we're not going to be involved in tit-for-tat retaliation with Donald Trump, and instead what we're going to do is try to build relationships with other countries, form new trading relationships to offset any loss of market access that you have here in the United States. This is a high-stakes political decision by Donald Trump. He says for decades he has believed that America has been ripped off by adversaries and allies alike. He likes to say that tariffs are one of his favourite words in the English dictionary, and he is going full throttle on putting up these barriers to completely reshape the way the American economy works. The test for him politically will be if the pain that Americans feel when they go to buy products in the coming weeks, months and years is more painful than any benefit they might see in terms of jobs returning to the United States if you actually do see manufacturing, for example, come back to the United States. And that's obviously a longer term consequence. The most immediate impact is going to be on higher prices. Donald Trump has just been returned to his second term of office. He's only still freshly reinstalled. He can't go for re-election, but this may well be his legacy on the line, and his popularity will be key when it comes to those midterm elections next year.
Carrington Clark reporting from Washington, D.C. And for more on the tariffs announcement from the United States, let's bring in Dr. Susan Stone, Chair of Economics with the Credit Union of South Australia. Good morning. Thank you for your company. What's your initial reaction?
Well, it's an interesting prospect that they outlined tariffs very high and then said that they would only impose half as a reciprocal tariff. So the Trump administration kind of have set themselves up as, I think, having some room to negotiate higher if there are retaliatory tariffs put in place, as some countries in the EU in particular have announced. So we'll have to see what plays out on that landscape. And the fact that for most countries, including Australia, they've imposed a 10% baseline tariff on everything.
I want to go to that 10% tariff. What does that mean, and what do you expect might be the impacts, the implications of that?
That, I think, is just a kind of, we're going to not give anybody any exemptions, let anybody off the hook when it comes to tariffs. Everybody's getting a tariff. I think 10% is a number, I mean, it is higher than many, especially Australian tariffs at the moment that Australia is facing with the U.S. It's probably not as high as maybe some others, but it's an across-the-board number that isn't tremendous. It's not the 20, 25% that he's been talking about in different sectors and against particular trading partners, but it is something there to try to drive other countries to the negotiating table, I think.
And what about, Dr. Stone, beef? The president honed in directly on Australian beef.
He did, but Australia is the 10%. They haven't included that, as far as I can tell, in kind of making the baseline tariff higher due to beef. But it probably is a indicator that the beef industry is on the Trump administration's radar and that they need to re-examine the current ban on fresh beef products that Australia has in place because of the BSE scare that was some years ago.
I did wonder if the reference that the president made to beef was really a shot across the paddock of warning that, particularly in terms of the biosecurity rules, if that's something that might come down the track or might be an area where Australia needs to really be considering how that it works really in relation to the United States.
No, I very much agree with that. I think that in terms of agriculture trade with Australia, that issue has come up in the U.S. for many years now. There are particular sectors that the U.S. is concerned about, beef being one of them. But if you look at another sector like pork, U.S. has been increasing exports of pork to Australia at a rate over the last 10 years of 200. The increase has been over 200%. So in some sectors, Australia has been increasing its imports from the U.S. In other sectors, beef is one of them. We haven't been. But prior to the ban, there weren't a lot of beef exports coming into Australia anyway. So it would be a new-ish market for the United States. And we would think they might, as you said, a shot across the bow, use that to open up negotiations on other markets within Australia.
Did you see it perhaps as a similar story with the pharmaceutical benefits scheme? Because we know that there have been lobbyists for many a year who have been raising these particular concerns with US lawmakers, and then we see it mentioned and as part of this broader discussion.
Yes, that's true. They have raised the PBS as part of the gripes, if you will, of some American industry sectors. Also, the ban on social media, the wanting some of the social media companies to pay for news content. These things have all come up in the course of the discussion of trade with Australia and potential barriers. One of the things I think the Trump administration is looking at is the degree to which Australia is a large enough market for these companies to really start pinpointing and going after the Australian market. Australia and the U.S. have a free trade agreement in place. Australia can use that as an initial mechanism with which to address any violations of that agreement. So that would probably prolong issues as we go along. So I think it's going to be a balancing act to see if the U.S. is going to kind of focus on these bigger markets, the EU markets, Japan, China, and try to bring them to the negotiating table and just keep Australia kind of, if you will, on its toes for the time being before it really gets into negotiating specific tariff relationships on these different sectors.
Yeah, I suspect that many people will be watching and listening to Donald Trump and thinking very deeply about the points that he's made and what that might signal into the future. I want to get your perspective on this 25% tariff on vehicles.
Right.
On face value, does that have any impact on Australia, given that we don't really have a vibrant car manufacturing industry?
In the sense that, to the extent that it disrupts the global trade of cars or makes cars more expensive more generally, to the extent that if Japanese source or the Canadian source parts or the U.S. source parts or the countries that we do buy cars from, to the extent that the parts that they're sourcing go up due to these tariffs, it will flow on to the price of cars globally, and therefore that may impact Australia. On the other hand, we may be benefiting from these countries who are looking for alternative markets on which to sell, into which to sell cars. And they want to keep those car sales up, so they may offer some deals to Australians to buy their cars in lieu of lost market share in the U.S.
We might have a silver lining there for Australia. Look, just finally, there's been a lot said about the impacts that this might have on global inflation. That is a red-hot issue here in the frame of the election, cost of living, interest rates and the whole lot. Do you have a sense of what impact broadly this suite of tariffs might have?
From the U.S. perspective, I think that's a real concern. If you look at where the big tariffs are coming in, they're coming in on countries like Bangladesh, on Cambodia, on Thailand, on Sri Lanka. These countries produce a lot of the goods that consumers buy. There's clothing, there's footwear, there's other types of furniture and things that everyday consumers buy. If you're putting a 49, 46, 44% tariff on these goods coming into the United States, that's going to have an immediate impact on everyday prices that U.S. consumers see in places like Walmart or Kmart or everyday shops, and that will have an impact on prices and on inflation. So from a U.S. perspective, I think that is a real concern. From an Australian perspective, I don't think it's as much of a concern. We do import a lot. Some markets import a great deal from the U.S., other markets don't. We have to see how that all plays out, but I think it's less of a concern for Australia than it is for the U.S., for sure.
Dr. Susan Stone, I really appreciate your time and all of your analysis. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Well, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has reaffirmed that Australia will not impose reciprocal tariffs in response to the US President's sweeping new duties. Anthony Albanese also announced multiple measures aimed at supporting Australian industries that are set to be impacted. For more on the political response, reporter Pablo Vinales joins us now from Parliament House in Canberra. Pablo, what did the Prime Minister have to say?
Dan, well, the Prime Minister was quick to respond and coming out quite strong, saying while it wasn't a surprise, expressing his disappointment at the decision, saying that every Australian has the right to feel like it has undermined fair and free trade between the two nations, between one of Australia's closest, if not Australia's closest allies. You mentioned, though, he was quick to rule out any reciprocal or retaliatory tariffs, saying that would only impact domestic consumers, and the argument that the Prime Minister is making that these tariffs only hurt American consumers as well. So quick to rule out any retaliatory tariffs being put on American goods, though he did threaten using dispute resolution powers against these sweeping tariffs. We know that Australia is considering taking this issue to the World Trade Organization. Obviously, there have been frantic negotiations ahead of these so-called liberation tariffs that the Australian government has been trying to seek an exemption, trying to put its case forward to the American president. The US president singled out Australia in his remarks as he was announcing these tariffs, in particular Australian beef, saying that the US imported around $3 billion worth of Australian beef, and that Australia does not take any of America's beef, saying, obviously expressing frustration at that. Of course, Australia doesn't import beef from the United States due to the mad cow disease scare back in 2003. And the Prime Minister was also stressing this morning that Australia would not compromise on this list of grievances that the White House put out in the days leading up to this announcement, namely on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, Australia's agricultural or biosecurity laws, and the media bargaining code. The Prime Minister stressing that Australia would not relent on any of these issues that the US has raised. We know that pharmaceuticals has been carved out in this imposition of these new tariffs, but on those biosecurity laws that Australia has in place, the Prime Minister stressing Australia was not compromising on this. Let's take a listen to what he had to say earlier this morning.
President Trump referred to reciprocal tariffs. A reciprocal tariff would be 0, not 10%. The administration's tariffs have no basis in logic, and they go against the basis of our two nations partnership. This is not the act of a friend. Today's decision will add to uncertainty in the global economy, and it will push up costs for American households. It is the American people who will pay the biggest price for these unjustified tariffs. This is why our government will not be seeking to impose reciprocal tariffs. We will not join a race to the bottom that leads to higher prices and slower growth.
And Pablo, this all comes while the Prime Minister is in campaign mode. The election's underway. The Prime Minister outlined a number of measures a re-elected Labor government would enact to support impacted Australian industries.
Dan Carrington was earlier speaking about the domestic implications politically for the US president. Well, it does have significant implications domestically here in Australia. As you mentioned, we are days into this federal election campaign. The Prime Minister was speaking about the importance of diversifying Australia's trade relationships in Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia and India as well. But he was also trying to put this into some perspective, saying that it accounts for only about 5% of Australia's exports, and that many other countries will be hit harder. That speaking about that 10% baseline tariff that has been applied to some Australian products, that saying comparatively compared to other countries, that Australia has come off relatively lightly and that no one has gotten a better deal. That's certainly how the Prime Minister is framing this. He did speak to some measures that the government has announced. Some were existing measures, but I'll talk you through some of the new measures that he announced this morning, around $50 million for affected sectors, and that will be provided through peak bodies such as the National Farmers Federation to help them chase new markets and and diversify their exports as well. The Prime Minister also announced an economic resilience program funded through the National Reconstruction Fund with $1 billion worth of zero-interest loans. He also spoke about pushing Australian companies to the front of the queue for government procurement, and also about strengthening Australia's anti-dumping regime for key sectors like steel and aluminium. Of course, that relates to the previous round of tariffs that were imposed on aluminium and steel across the board as well. It is interesting to note as well, Dan, we heard from the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, calling for unity on this and pointedly speaking to how people who are seeking to become Prime Minister, so not necessarily naming Peter Dutton, but saying that this is a time for unity and putting that pressure on the opposition leader to show a bipartisan approach to this in the context of a federal election.
Pablo Vinales reporting from Parliament House in Canberra. Well, let's get more from the campaign trail now. Political reporter Tom Lowry is on the road with the Prime Minister in Melbourne and joins us now on the bus. In fact, Tom, the Prime Minister's position unchanged. Very strong media conference this morning and very strong comments, particularly following this tariff announcement.
Yeah, good morning, Pablo. This was, I suppose you could call it an expected curveball on the campaign. We knew this tariffs announcement was coming, but we weren't quite sure what it was going to look like. So we saw a fairly immediate reaction from the Prime Minister. He stood up only a few minutes after Donald Trump had wrapped and had some fairly strong comments on the US relationship, describing this as not the action of a friend. Said it will add to uncertainty on global economic markets and that it's Americans, he says, who will pay the biggest consequences, the biggest price for these new tariffs. Of course, this all plays out in the context, as Pablo referred to there, of the election campaign. And the Prime Minister was questioned on some early comments from Peter Dutton as well, who was on radio this morning and suggested it was something of a failure that the Prime Minister hadn't managed to get the US President Donald Trump on the phone for a third phone call to discuss these tariffs and other issues. The Prime Minister making an appeal for bipartisanship, I suppose, saying that this is something that should be above the politics of the election campaign as Australia responds to these new imposts. In the days leading up to this tariff announcement, the PM had been keen to downplay any suggestion of significant economic consequences for Australia, pointing out that the US is, of course, a major trading partner, but only 5% or so of Australia's exports are bound for the US, and talking up other prospects for Australia's exports as well, including renewing talk of a free trade deal with Europe, something that had been on ice at this point, something that the Trade Minister Don Farrell had been working on for some time, but it essentially all but fallen over, really. Don Farrell saying that is something they're very keen to now talk to the Europeans about. So, a fairly sort of, I suppose, quite strongly worded at times press conference there from the Prime Minister on the American relationship, but also keen to point out that in areas like defence, like AUKUS, which it was also questioned on, things remain entirely the same. So a different trading relationship, but situation normal in other areas.
Yeah, it seemed very clear the message the Prime Minister was making. Tom, do we know what else is on Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's agenda for the rest of today?
Yeah, look, he's starting the day, obviously, in Melbourne, Dan. That's where we are now. We've just left the CPO, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Offices here in Melbourne, where that press conference has been held. It's been the election campaign. We just don't quite know where we're going next. He spent yesterday in Melbourne and also Tasmania too, making a quick trip down there in the afternoon to northern Tasmania, to Burnie, which is always an electoral battleground. So the first time I think either campaign had touched ground in Tasmania for this election. We may be, staying in Melbourne. This is, of course, a pretty heated electoral battleground of itself. There's plenty of seats in Melbourne up for grabs, or perhaps could we be bound elsewhere around the country. The PM seems to be making something of an effort to try and reach really every corner of the country just in this first week. He's been to every state or territory bar the Northern Territory so far, and we aren't even 7 days in. So could perhaps give you an indication of where we might be heading. Perhaps if he wants to, tick all of those boxes off, or just at least, give the impression that he is, trying to reach every little part of the country just in these first few days.
Yep, well, we'll be watching every step of the way. Tom Lowry there reporting from the campaign trail with Anthony Albanese. And we're yet to see any reaction to Donald Trump's sweeping new tariffs regime from the opposition. Peter Dutton is starting the day in Western Australia, where he's set to announce a $600 million roads package. Political reporter Isabel Rowe has the latest from Perth.
Well, this is the first journey west for Peter Dutton during this campaign. He's here to launch the campaign of his Liberal candidate for the seat of Pearce. Now, this isn't the most marginal seat in Western Australia, but it is one that the Coalition believe they could win, because in the recent state election there has been some sentiment in this area back towards the Coalition and away from Labor. Now, Peter Dutton doesn't need any encouragement in this environment. These are Liberal supporters. What he does need to do is convince the voters of Western Australia that he has something for them. He has made some big announcements already that will be of interest to Western Australians, and he's spoken about them tonight. He's pledged to give the green light to Woodside's Northwest Gas Shelf project, and that will extend that project until 2070. And it's been in the hands of the government, which has delayed a decision on that until after the election. He has also come with his chequebook out, announcing a $600 million roads program for WA for agricultural and mining roads that need upgrading. That is something he says that will help boost the state's economy. The state election in WA just a few weeks ago was a resounding win for Labor. So Peter Dutton has some work to do in this area, but he has just told the crowd that if he wins Pearce, he wins the election.
Isabel Rowe there reporting from the election campaign on the opposition side with Peter Dutton. We'll bring you comments from the opposition leader, or in fact from the Prime Minister, as more come to hand today. Well, staying with the election campaign, the division of Fowler has emerged as a key battleground seat right here in Western Sydney, with the incumbent independent member, Di Lee, facing a strong push from Labor's candidate, Tu Lee. In 2022, Tu Lee was considered a shoo-in for Labor pre-selection in the seat, but was passed over for former Labor Senator Christina Keneally, who did not live in the electorate and was parachuted into the race. Many say that contributed to Di Lee's victory, as she became the first non-Labor representative in the electorate's history. Tu Lee joins me in the studio. Now, before we begin the interview, the ABC News Channel has requested an interview with Di Lee, and we hope to speak with her in the coming weeks. There's also no Liberal candidate running for Fowler. Tu Lee, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
Tell me about Fowler. What do Australians need to know about this electorate, which many are seeing as key in this election?
Well, Fowler is an extremely diverse and wonderful community. It's a great part of Australia, and I'm very proud to live and work in Fowler. At the moment, it is a very, very key seat for the government to have to win back, and I'm doing everything I can to fight for every vote back for the Labor Party to ensure that we do maintain majority government.
And while you've been out on the hustings and indeed campaigning before that, what are the key issues that voters here, or in that seat in fact, are telling you is at the front of their mind?
Well, everybody is obviously very concerned with cost of living at the moment. So that's what I'm hearing at the doors, but also with housing affordability, a lot of people are experiencing either rental stress or mortgage stress. And as someone with a young growing family in the local community, I completely empathise with that. And that's why our community deserves to have a strong voice in government, someone who understands the struggles, but also the aspirations of our very diverse and hard-working community in Fowler.
A young family indeed. I think you might have a 4-week-old. You were actually, I think you might have been on the campaign trail or preparing for it when you gave birth.
That's right. I was out at the train station in the morning, and my water broke that morning, and I gave birth to my daughter that evening. But you know what? That just makes me even more determined to make sure that we make life better for local communities and local families in my community, but right across Australia. And that's just an additional driving force for me in this upcoming election.
Well, congratulations on the safe birth of your daughter. That is good news. I want to go back to 2022. This was a huge shift here. We saw the parachuting of Christina Keneally, who was a senator for Labor, into that seat. You were seen as the shoo-in. You had the endorsement of the outgoing Labor MP. At the time, you were very critical of Labor, particularly around diversity and reflecting the multiculturalism of this seat. We saw a huge swing. I think it was about 18.5% against Labor. That's a huge loss of trust.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's important that we do acknowledge that, the decision that was made was a mistake, and we paid the ultimate price for it as a party. But I'm very much focused on the upcoming election. And as I said, fighting to win every vote back to the Labor Party. It is a very hard-working community in Fowler and has traditionally always voted for Labor. I think it's a huge lesson learnt for all parties. And, we will never take the community for granted ever again. And I'm here now knowing that we do need, and that's what I'm hearing, a strong voice in government to actually be able to deliver for our local community. We need better resources, we need better services. There is a lot of help that's being provided by the government by way of cost of living relief, and I'm hearing that people are very grateful for that, but there is so much more that's to be done. And as someone who is local, as someone who is hopefully going to be a representative in government, I'll be able to make sure that we get our fair share in Fowler.
Do you think that trust has been recovered? Because it was a national story. It was enormous at the time. You were right at the centre of it, for no doing of your own. I wonder if the trust has been rebuilt, and how then you try and articulate that to an electorate that has voted in an independent for the first time, who has been very prominent on the national stage and very prominent in Parliament.
I think the last election was a response to the Labor Party's candidate, but at the moment we do have someone in me who is local, who is working very hard to remind people about the Labor values and also let them know what we're actually delivering and currently delivering for families in Fowler by way of cost of living relief. A lot of people, I think there is a big message gap, and we're really trying to meet people halfway. I'm out there speaking to community members in various ways, out at the playgrounds with my child, speaking to mothers and families there. I'm meeting with people at cafes, and I'm doing everything to speak to as many electors in the electorate as possible to remind them as to why having a Labor government is going to be helpful to communities and families in Fowler.
And as well as meeting the commitments that Labor has made more broadly, what are you offering to voters in Fowler?
I think the big difference is going to be someone who actually has a voice in government, someone who is going to stand up for the values of our community, someone who understands very deeply, the struggles that a lot of families are currently facing, and also our aspirations. I have a young growing family, I have a mortgage, I rely heavily on childcare subsidies. I'm experiencing a lot of the things that our hardworking families are experiencing. And as I said, even with a newborn daughter, it makes me even more determined, and that's one more reason why I want to make life better for our local families and for families right across Australia.
Tu Le, good to have you along. Thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you more throughout this election campaign. That was Tu Le, the Labor candidate for the seat of Fowler. And we're going to go back to our lead story now and get more reaction to today's tariffs announcement. Nationals leader David Littleproud joins me live. David, thank you for your company. What's your immediate reaction?
Deep disappointment that President Trump has imposed tariffs on Australia. We're a trusted partner of the United States, and we stand with the government in opposing this. But what we need is a relationship reset. We've got a Prime Minister that unfortunately can't even get a phone call with the President, and I sense that's probably because of the personal disparaging comments he's made about President Trump in the past. So we need to have a reset to explain to President Trump, particularly when you look about the tariffs he's imposed on beef. He's actually imposing that cost on his own people because the meat that we send is lean meat. The United States doesn't produce enough to go into their patties and their burgers to achieve that. So they have to bring it in from another part of the world, and they will have to pay for that. But we're not going to reduce our biosecurity standards. There are risk assessments taken all the time. The issue is not necessarily with BSE with the United States. They haven't had it for 10 years, but it's their supply chain in the Americas, with particularly Canada and Mexico, that we can't get certainty on that gives us that confidence to allow that product to come in. But we already take frozen beef into the United States. We've already made concessions. So there is a compelling case. And what President Trump also failed to acknowledge is that the United States farmer is subsidised by the US government. Of the 38 OECD countries, there's only one country that subsidises farmers less than Australia, and that's New Zealand. We're right down the bottom. We don't subsidise our farmers, and so there needs to be a line of communication open up so that we can actually not only get Australia's case heard, but we need to lead the rest of the world with President Trump in getting him back to a rules-based order. But you can't do that if you don't have a relationship. We also need to take decisive action, Dan, here and now in re-engaging with our partners in the CTPP, the comprehensive Trans-Pacific partnership that we created with 10 other like countries that have also been impacted. We should do that immediately to make sure we have new markets. We should re-engage with the EU, as well as making sure, and Prime Minister Dutton would be in the United States seeing President Trump within the first couple of months. They're decisive actions that need to be taken place. But if you don't have respect and you can't get in the door or get on the phone, then Australia's going to be hamstrung. And so we need to reset this relationship with the United States, and we need to do that quickly.
I want to, David Littleproud, in a moment just get to the impacts for pastoralists in Australia. But the Prime Minister gave a very strong news conference this morning, unequivocal, you might say, about the position Australia was taking. It sounds like, as I'm listening to you, you're on the same page. You're saying we are not moving on biosecurity and we are not changing gears on this.
No, we've always been a rules-based order of trade, and that's predicated by science, and that's important. That we only hold product out of this country, particularly where we have free trade agreements, predicated on science and biosecurity risk, because we can't put at risk our industry for pests and diseases that we don't have here. And that's actually respected and understood as part of WTO rules, and that's what we'll live by. That's why Australia is a trusted partner. Now, we take risk assessments all the time when there's requests made, but there's been no scientific find, not necessarily on the United States, as I say, but their supply chains, and they have a broader supply chain than just the United States. It's obviously across the Americas, and that opens up risk, and that's risk we can't accept. But we are with the government in opposing these tariffs. But how do we actually reset the relationship is the question here, and you can't do that if you don't have a relationship, and you've hurt that relationship with disparaging comments. And this is an opportunity for us to reset our relationship with the United States, not just for Australia, but to get the world back to a rules-based order, because these tariffs are going to hurt the world, they're going to hurt Australia, and this isn't good. We need to get back to this, but someone's got to lead it. And you can only do that if you've got a relationship with President Trump.
David Littleproud, in terms of the pastoralists, the big issue here immediately might not necessarily be the tariffs themselves, but the market that Australian beef goes to. So how important right now is it to be finding additional markets, coupled with, not far from where you are, of course, we have reports as late as yesterday saying that 140,000 head of cattle might have been lost in these floods and rains that we've seen, which is also going to have another flow-on effect.
Yeah, and this is where Kevin Hogan, our trade spokesman, has been working through this in terms of measures of response. And this is why, when we created the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership, 10 other like-minded countries that the world said we could never do, but we ended up achieving in 2018, will be so important to re-engage immediately, to be able to open up that opportunity of more markets, because this will have a recalibration on world markets, and it's important that we lead that and we take the opportunities by those trade agreements that we put in place to be able to do that. And Kevin has made that clear that he'll engage with that immediately, as well as re-engage with the EU about a free trade agreement there. So those new markets are important, but we also need, and we should not give up on resetting the relationship with the United States to help get back to a rules-based order. And we're not afraid to go to the WTO. We've respected the rules all the way along, and that's how the world should operate. But these new markets can only be done if you engage quickly. This isn't about just throwing $50 million out the door now. This is actually now understanding the world has changed, but we can take a leadership role with that because of the free trade agreements that we've led internationally that we can leverage on to get new markets. And when you think about what's happening in my electorate in Western Queensland, I think the 150,000 is just initial. Once the waters go down, I think it could be more than that. And I've got to thank Premier Crucifulli. Oh, it's very hard. I mean, you're talking an area. I mean, my electorate's 3 times the size of Victoria, and they're talking about an area that's underwater out there. So 2/3 of my electorate, 2 times the state of Victoria is underwater out there at the moment. Vast distances. We just don't know until we can get the water goes down a little bit and we can make those assessments. But I have every confidence the Queensland government, and I think all levels of government, local government's really led, but also the federal government's made sure that every resource and when the ADF's required, they are at standby. I think everyone's worked cooperatively, and I think we should be proud as a nation that we can do that.
I'm conscious that I'm going to have to let you go at some point, but I've got a compound question for you. Is that, do you see the comments that President Trump made about beef really being a shot across the paddock of saying that there's more to come if you don't fall into line? And do you, if you were in government, if you win the election in a couple of weeks, would you consider WTO action and that $50 million for affected markets that the Prime Minister has announced this morning?
Yeah, and we'll look at the detail, because there's a little bit of confusion about exact details on some of this. But yes, we've been a rules-based trading partner, and those rules within the WTO should apply. And when we're in government, we've got form. We took China to the WTO. We even took Canada to the WTO on wine. So you should stick to the process and respect the process. But again, what we want to do is actually reset the relationship with President Trump. You're not going to change his mind unless you can get a reset. You actually get in the door or even get him to pick the phone up. And that's what we need to understand. If we reset the relationship, not only this is about Australia, but this is about getting the world back to an equilibrium of a rules-based order. And that's what, if we're elected in 4 weeks, Prime Minister Dutton would be on a plane near immediately to Washington to meet with President Trump to have this out with him and to make sure he understands the impact this will have not just on the world, but this is going to have a consequence on the United States as well. This is inflationary for the whole world, and there needs some leadership here, strong leadership. You can only do that if you've got a relationship, and that relationship needs to be reset.
Nationals leader David Littleproud, appreciate your time there from Hervey Bay. I think in the seat of Wide Bay as we're well into the swing of this election. Good to have you along.
Hinkler.
Hinkler. Just next door.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Live across Australia on ABC TV and streaming on ABC iView and online. You're with ABC News Mornings. I'm Dan Borshett, coming to you from the studio here in Parramatta in Western Sydney. These are the top stories we're following this hour. US President Donald Trump has signed an executive order imposing a baseline 10% tariff on all foreign imports into the country, including from Australia. The order also includes even tougher reciprocal taxes on dozens of the so-called worst offenders. Some of the harshest duties include a 34% tax on Chinese imports and a 20% tariff on goods from the European Union. The baseline tariff will take effect this Saturday, while the reciprocal tariffs will come into effect from next Wednesday. The Prime Minister has labelled the tariffs, quote, not the act of a friend and totally unwarranted. Anthony Albanese has confirmed Australia won't impose retaliatory tariffs and has reiterated earlier promises his government will not negotiate on biosecurity or the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. Myanmar's military government has announced it will halt attacks on rebel forces for 3 weeks to concentrate on recovering from last week's deadly magnitude 7.7 earthquake. The death toll has surpassed 3,000, but it's expected to rise further as rescue and recovery operations continue. And communities in flood-affected Queensland are waiting for floodwaters to recede to assess the damage. The record rainfall is expected to ease from Friday, but it could be weeks before recovery efforts can begin. Livestock losses are now estimated to be close to 150,000. And continuing with that report, primary producers in flood-affected Queensland say it could be years before they recover from the latest natural disaster. Several towns are still inundated and isolated, with local authorities saying it could be weeks before floodwaters fully recede. Reporter Mackenzie Colohan joins me now from Longreach in central Queensland. Mackenzie, there's been more rain overnight.
There has, Dan, a lot more rain here in Longreach overnight. It was quite heavy, and I was actually pretty surprised when I spoke to the Bureau this morning and found out it was only 20 millimetres. It felt like a lot more. Down the road, Tambo got another 30 millimetres, and there have been falls of between 50 and 100 millimetres recorded in other parts of outback Queensland. I know that here on the outskirts of Longreach, the Thompson River has broken its banks and flooded paddocks for hundreds of metres around. It's been rising steadily over the last couple of days. This should hopefully be the peak, and thankfully that will mean it is not going to threaten homes and businesses in the town itself. But according to the Bureau, there is so much water in these catchments that even if there is no more rain, major flooding will persist for up to a month. And what this extra rain has meant is that roads that had closed, roads have now closed that were starting to reopen, and some of the worst affected communities are going to be cut off now for even longer. Many of those isolated towns and properties are still relying on deliveries of supplies from the air, and because the weather was so bad yesterday, many helicopters weren't able to fly. Those flights are now thankfully picking up again today.
And Mackenzie, what's the latest on stock losses? We just heard from David Littleproud from the Nationals a moment ago saying there are fears that the number of losses is much, much higher than what we've seen so far.
Yeah, that's right. And if it wasn't for the incredible work that a lot of these helicopter pilots are doing, delivering fodder, Premier David Crisafulli said yesterday he thought stock losses could have got into the millions. But at this stage, the latest estimate is 150,000 dead or missing, which includes 70,000 cattle, 70,000 sheep, and then around 10,000 horses and goats. I must stress that that number is based on surveys by the Department of Primary Industries. And at this stage, they've just spoken to 98 of the largest landholders. So as they speak to more, that number is definitely going to increase over the coming days and weeks. The Premier was actually in Western Queensland yesterday. He flew into Longreach. He had a chat with some locals and inspected the damage from the air. The Queensland government has increased its assistance grants for primary producers to $75,000. But Dan, for a lot of farmers in the region, that's only going to scratch the surface, and the damage bill is going to be much higher.
Mackenzie Colohan reporting from Longreach. Well, let's get more on Australia's response to the United States tariffs announcement this morning. Andrew McKellar is Chief Executive of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and joins me now. Good morning. Thank you for your company. What's your reaction to this suite of announcements?
Good morning, Dan. Good to be with you. Look, it's a disappointing announcement. There's no doubt about that. In the broad picture, it is a backward step for international trade. They are significant measures that are being imposed to a range of very substantial trading partners of the United States, and obviously I think that runs the risk that we could see further retaliation across the international trading environment. Now, that would be a bad thing. It would be a bad thing for all countries. It would be a bad thing for Australia. I think the only point of light in all of this is from a direct Australian standpoint. We're in the lowest bracket of measures at 10%, along with the UK and Singapore and a number of other economies. So at least from that point of view, relative to some other significant trading partners, we've escaped relatively lightly. But it's not a great thing. It's not a friendly act. And from business's point of view, we obviously want to work closely with the government to push back on this in whatever way we possibly can.
And we've heard very strong language, unequivocal from the Prime Minister, that there will be no reciprocal tariffs, that he is also saying that this is very unfriendly, and that there will be a whole suite, a raft of measures, $50 million for affected markets to be able to search for new markets, and a suite of zero-interest loans as well. David Littleproud, the leader of the Nationals, was speaking to me earlier and seemed to be in lockstep with those positions. What have you made of the reactions, and where does that set up Australian businesses going forward?
Well, I think one of the things Australian businesses, Australian exporters have got to do, and the message has been there for several years now, off the back of the trade measures that China imposed. We've got to look to diversify our trading base. We've got to look for other markets that we can grow, and Australia has in the recent past signed new agreements with the UK, with the UAE. We've got a framework in place with India. It's possible that we could restart negotiations with the EU. So I think all of those things are there for potential diversification of our markets. I think that's one important step. But certainly we agree with the government's position. There's no point seeking to impose some sort of reciprocal restrictions on US exports. That would only end up hurting Australian consumers. It would be a tax on Australian consumers. So we don't think that that would be effective. It wouldn't achieve anything. Let's look at those other channels that we've got to really promote new opportunities in other markets.
And I was speaking to Dr. Susan Stone a little earlier about the particular focusing in on Australia's beef market and also on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. On face value, it would appear that they're being highlighted because the US president wants Australia to be aware that they're part of his focus. What was your reaction?
Well, the pharmaceutical benefits scheme has been a long-running irritant from the US side. Their major pharmaceutical companies feel that it suppresses the prices that they get. The major Australian political parties have been very clear on this, whether it's government or opposition. They're not in the business of trading off our pharmaceutical benefits scheme. It delivers cheaper medicines to Australians, more cost-effective healthcare. That's important to us, and I think that's well understood, well established from an Australian standpoint. So I think that's clear. Beef, obviously, again, there've been, I think, concerns from the US side about the biosecurity measures into the Australian market. Those, I think, have to be examined on a completely scientific and technical basis. That they're not there as a trade restriction or trade measure. They're there to protect what is a very valuable industry to us. So look, we stand with Australian farmers and Australian food producers. We want to defend those interests. It's not a surprise that the US is raising these issues, but Australian beef is world class. And it's very popular in the United States, and understandably so.
And look, just before I let you go, based on what we heard this morning, which areas of Australian business and industry do you expect to be the most impacted?
Well, clearly, I mean, there's the risk now with beef that there could be an impact there, but already we've seen steel and aluminium tariffs. What's been imposed previously with the 25% tariff, this 10% we understand it's compounding, so it's on top of that. So that's a double whammy already for those exporters. But certainly beef is a big product going into the US market, around 400,000 tonnes. We do sell pharmaceuticals to the US, so again, any restraint or restriction in that area, that's worth upwards of $1 billion each year. There could be an impact there. So look, obviously, it's not our biggest trading market. It's an important market, and I think any restriction is going to be regrettable and come at the cost of both economies.
Andrew McKellar is Chief Executive of the Australian Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks very much.
And we'll have a lot more on this breaking news out of the United States coming up right across the day here on the ABC News channel, including reaction and broad political reaction here in Australia as we're in day 6 of the federal election campaign. Well, let's have a quick look at the national weather now. In Brisbane, a shower or two. Sunny for Sydney and Canberra. Showers increasing in Melbourne. In Hobart, a shower or two. Partly cloudy for Adelaide. Perth, a possible shower and mostly sunny and 33 for Darwin. And there's more on the ABC News app and on ABC iView. I'm Dan Borscher. Thanks for your company. We'll be back shortly.